You think so? Yeah. All right.
All right, I have Wendy on my screen and Laura as well. So the entire committee is in attendance. I think we can get started.
Yeah, you can go ahead and mute your microphone. Good morning, everyone. I didn't know if it made best sense to hop up and wrestle a laptop from Katie, but I think I'll just do it from where I'm sitting here. Thank you all for coming here to support Katie Gach as she's defending her dissertation. I want to give special thanks, of course, to her committee members in order that I'm seeing them. First, virtually, Laura Devendorf, Atlas Institute, Wendy Munker, who's joining us from across the pond. So good to see you, Wendy. And then here in person, we have Nabil and Casey. And yeah, let me talk a little bit. Oh, and then of course we have a bunch of supportive colleagues and family and friends of Katie's. So thank you all for being here as well. Let me go ahead and talk a little bit about how things are going to happen today before I turn the floor over, or the Zoom end floor over. You are all brave people for engaging in, I think, the first hybrid defense that I've been in. But let me give you a little rundown of how things are going to happen. As soon as I'm done talking and you all take a big sigh of relief, we're going to turn the floor over to Katie to present her work for about 40 minutes. Following that, we're going to open the floor up to the committee members for Q&A. We traditionally start with the committee member who is furthest away and most prestigious and who we want to honor the most. And so Wendy, that is you, followed by Nabil, and we'll work our way inward. You, of course, can always pass and we'll come back to you. Provided we have time, we'll then open up the floor for Q&A from the general public. But if we are short on time, then when the committee leaves to deliberate, I will let Katie continue with the Q&A with the rest of you during that time. So after that Q&A, we'll deliberate. You can hound her with the really hard questions at that point. And then we will come back and we will know where we're at with this great piece of work. Are there any questions you have for me, Katie, before I turn it over to you?
I think so.
Committee members, if you have questions, you can toss them into chat, or I don't know, find me on one of any of a dozen channels. Beyond that, let's go ahead and turn the floor over to Katie to present her dissertation on how to delete the dead. Take it away, Katie.
Thank you, Ben. Most 2021 beginning to a dissertation possible. Thank you for that introduction, Jed, and thank you to my committee members for being here and taking so much time, and thank you to my colleagues and my friends and family who have joined us this morning. I'm excited to present my dissertation work on how to delete the dead, honoring affective connections to postmortem data. As a brief content warning, I do want to tell you that I will be discussing bodies and burials, causes of death, including violence, as well as people's general experiences with grief and loss, so please listen with care. I'll start this presentation with an introduction to the problem space where I've been working, tell you a little bit about what other researchers have done in this space so far, and then I'll talk about how I address the problem and the research setting where my studies took place. And then we'll get to the good stuff. I'll talk about my research findings, as well as why they're important and what implications I think they have for our field, and then we will be done. So for those of you that might have to cut out early, here's what I want you to learn today. There are critical misalignments between how Facebook's postmortem management works and what people actually need from it. And I'm going to argue that those misalignments are rooted in computational understandings of individual identity, which come up short when an account holder dies. Furthermore, I'm going to argue that a more communal model of identity can provide better guidance for managing postmortem data. So let's start with postmortem data. What is it? So post, after, mortem, death, data after death. For people who spend our lives online, what should happen to the data that we leave behind? After all, our data doesn't decay or disappear like we do as living things. And with or without our choices or configuration, the data we leave behind takes work to manage. So despite some progress toward digital legacy management becoming more common for living people with online accounts, survivors typically have to manage postmortem data without any instructions from the account holder or without any options from the platforms themselves. But why manage postmortem data at all? Why can't we just let things sit and remain as they are? Well, unmanaged postmortem data can lead to what we call algorithmic cruelty, which is what happens when content related to a deceased person is automatically displayed through algorithmic activity to people in a way that causes them emotional distress. And the most common example of this is birthday reminders for people who have passed away. But online profiles and online presences can become meaningful memorial spaces that contribute to people's cathartic communications about the deceased. So the example you see here is a message that I left on my friend's profile on his birthday a few months after he died from cancer. And you also see that it wasn't just me who did this. There were 24 of us who left birthday tributes to my friend. So as much as we like to say that technology makes death startling or hard in new ways, I think it's really helpful to consider the parallels of postmortem data management and our interactions with memorials in the physical world. In physical spaces, we know how to do memorials. We have established practices for what to do after a death. And those practices involve, first of all, bodies. We take care to put a person's physical remains in a final resting place. And then, of course, we have their possessions, the things that were belonging to that person during their life that were useful to them, as well as memorabilia. These are things with sentimental value or things that were collected or created specifically for remembrance purposes. And then we have records of correspondence. We have letters and cards from them. And we also hold spaces related to them as sacred and important, like their favorite chair, maybe they liked their garden. So the work of recognizing and creating and maintaining these memorial spaces is part of how people enter into and practice their grieving process. And there's typically support and structures for doing so. So I want to call to your attention a specific kind of memorial space that I think serves as a really instructional, metaphorical example for what I'll be talking about today. And that's the memorial fence or the memorial wall. And we see memorials like this appear, these public altars, appear after all kinds of tragedies like accidental or violent deaths, or after celebrity deaths. They're especially common. And this particular one is a photo that I took of the King Soopers in South Boulder. And my community formed this memorial after the mass shooting that happened there in March. Spaces like this that are related to the deceased enable community grief and remembrance in ways that are really important. And I offer this example because social media profiles are a lot like these spaces. So I'm going to refer to this throughout the presentation as a reference and a metaphor. The problem is profiles are like memorial walls, but they also combine elements of other postmortem work that we're familiar with. So the online profile of a deceased person, like this Facebook profile, we don't necessarily have a body, but this is the primary medium of interacting with this person in the given digital space. We don't have any physical possessions of theirs, but we do have a lot of words and images that they created and used to communicate with us. We don't have letters and cards, but we do have a lot of records of our conversations and interactions with them. And all these things are conveniently gathered in one singular place where we can look at them, so that space becomes one of significance for remembrance, not unlike a gravestone or memorial fence where people can visit and feel connected to the deceased. But of course, profiles are not physical spaces, so the ways that we create and interact with online memorials present really interesting challenges. So my dissertation is focused on the things that can happen to social media accounts after account holders die, but more so about how people doing the work to make and maintain those memorials are affected by the existing options, or more often, a lack thereof. So let's have a bit of background about the intersection of death and social media. Let's just think about data in a general sense. The data we create throughout our lifetime is often called a digital footprint. It's the shape our activity has made of us in the digital world. But Australian philosopher Patrick Stokes argues for understanding our data as digital remains, which should be treated with the same care and dignity as physical remains. And the ways we interact with postmortem data really lend a lot to this argument. We maintain our relationships with the dead through the data they leave behind, as with the example of the birthday messages that we left for my friend. So this is in line with continuing bonds theory, that our relationships with the dead do not end with their death. Rather, it's normal and it's good for us to maintain and nurture their relationship and let it change over time, even after they're gone. Yet data is still handled and regulated as a possession, owned by a singular person, while in practice, it's more like a memorial space and memorabilia and remains all at once. So it's possible that ownership doesn't necessarily make sense as a model for managing postmortem data. Thankfully, we have alternative models to understand postmortem data. The model I want to call your attention to today is stewardship. And this contrasts with ownership in that it honors the choices that this person made during their lifetime, while enabling some responsiveness to the needs of the bereaved. In doing so, a stewardship model of postmortem management acknowledges profiles as active communal spaces that have shifting and emerging needs. And this is the model that Facebook used to employ, this is the model that Facebook employed in their design of Legacy Contact, which is their postmortem data management system. It's currently the only major social media platform with any death-related options for account holders. So to understand why the balance of stewardship is important, think about the memorial fence at my supermarket. There's another way that I see it as similar to a memorial profile online. That space at the supermarket had become sacred to the memory of the 10 people that we lost that day, but it's also the property of a national business. So there were groups that were invested in this space. There were the surviving loved ones, of course, the community that surrounded them, but there's also this large company that was invested in management. So they had been working together to maintain that memorial along the fence and to derive a plan for the store's future. So this balance is typical for death work. You often have survivors and community, but also medical professionals and funeral directors and other supportive structures that are involved in making that work happen. So what this work looks like in memorial space is what I wanted to understand. So this is my specific research setting. What happens to a dead person's Facebook account? So this is going to be as brief of an overview as possible, just so you understand the details of what my participants experienced. So this is a memorialized Facebook account. This is a stock photo example that Facebook uses, like directly from the company. So you notice it says remembering above the name, and there's a banner with some information the first time you sign on to it to let people know what this space is for. Additionally, memorialized profiles cannot be signed into even if you know the password. And that's a security measure that's taken to keep those accounts safe. But as of 2015, there are options for account holders to maintain some control over what happens to their profiles after they die. The first option they have is to choose a legacy contact or a steward to manage their memorialized profile after they pass away. And the second option, of course, is having their account deleted. So let's start with the first option. If you choose a legacy contact, the next screen tells you what you can do. It's important to know what exactly a legacy contact can do. They can manage tribute posts. They can request the removal or deletion of the account at a later date. They can respond to new friend requests. And they can update the profile picture and the cover photo. It also specifies that they cannot view your private messages and they cannot post as you. This is all the legacy contact can do. So once you select a Facebook friend to be your legacy contact, as I've done here, you're prompted to send this pre-written message. It says, Facebook lets people choose a legacy contact to manage their profile if something happens to them. So since you know me well and I trust you, I choose you. So even if you don't send this message in Messenger to your legacy contact will receive an email from Facebook's Help Center informing them of your choice. So the other option, deletion, follows a very similar workflow. If the account holder chooses delete after death, they'll confirm that they want that with some additional information. And then they will be prompted to tell a friend about the decision to have the account deleted. So they can do that or not. And after a Facebook account holder passes away, someone has to report their death to Facebook using this form in the help center. So they fill out some basic information, then they would receive a confirmation email or a request for additional information about the deceased to confirm the death. And then the change has been made, it's done. So if the person had chosen a legacy contact, their profile looks like this. You see, you have your remembering, you have the tribute section here where it prompts you to share a thought or memory. If you want to look at the timeline of what they posted throughout their life, you can do so by switching over to that. And then if you are the legacy contact, and only if you are the legacy contact, you have this manage button here, which takes you to a menu to perform those 4 tasks I mentioned before. But if the person had selected delete after death, upon completing that form in the help center, this is what you see. So profile deletion after a death removes all content and connections created by the deceased person throughout all of their time using Facebook. And that actually includes private messages. So you see here this is my conversation with someone who deleted their profile. Everything I sent to them remains, but everything they sent to me is gone. So deletion actually creates a legal obligation for Facebook to make it appear as if that person had never interacted with the platform at all. But most people do nothing. It remains pretty uncommon for people to find and configure these settings on Facebook. So the default is what happens to most people's profiles. The default is memorialization with no legacy contact. And these spaces, again, are meant to be dynamic and communal spaces that are similar to that public altar at the supermarket. The interested parties in the memorial profile are the same, and there's a lot that's done to maintain the appropriate balance of care for all of them. And Facebook has really spearheaded any social media movement toward robust post-mortem account management options in this way. But the platform itself retains a disproportionate amount of agency over what happens to the user's digital remains. The entire memorial space that people come to rely on for remembrance is still subject to the functions and the policies of the platform itself. So this would kind of be like if King Soopers management company had all the agency in managing that side of remembrance, and if their primary concerns were about the legal obligation to their assets. And that would kind of be like if a funeral director got to decide who could come to a memorial service, or if the cemetery staff could decide what appears on someone's gravestone. So whether the balance is right or not, the work of postmortem data management with all of these involved parties needs to be done. So through my research findings, I'm going to show you how postmortem data management is happening because of dedicated features to do so, but also sometimes in spite of and even without any dedicated features. So here's how I did the work. Remember that Facebook offers 2 options for account holders, memorialization and deletion, and I wanted to capture all possible interactions with those 2 different options. So we began by evaluating the setup process, and I asked, how do people think and communicate about their own social media legacies? So this study asked account holders, hey, who did you pick as your legacy contact and why? And then we asked those legacy contacts how they felt about being chosen. And then we talked to active legacy contacts to find out what are the experiences of people who have to actually manage a deceased loved one's profile. The third study similarly captured this account holder configuration in contrast with lived experiences, but with deletion, to find out what makes postmortem profile deletion desirable for account holders, but really difficult for survivors. So these 3 studies acknowledge the options that Facebook has, and they also acknowledge this difficult proxy relationship that exists where someone has to act on behalf of another who cannot consult or may not have provided any instructions when they're actually doing the work. So the 4th study addresses the people doing the work with what happens most of the time. The account holder had passed away with no configuration or choices or instructions. And I wanted to know if ritual-based guidance for postmortem data management or disposal could create a meaningful experience with postmortem data management. So capturing each of these facets gives a holistic an in-depth understanding of what postmortem profile management is on Facebook, as well as what it could be on any platform. And yes, it was emotionally heavy at times to be talking with people who had experienced a significant loss. So the skills to do this kind of emotionally heavy, sensitive work have taken years to learn. I relied heavily on my background in cultural anthropology to really step into my participants' experiences during interviews and really focus on their meanings and their relationships with their world, while also being attentive to the culturally bound understanding of what death is and what should happen after a death. So qualitative work was a really good fit for this because we've all heard that everyone grieves differently. So there was a lot of richness and detail to capture in people's experiences in this context. And I took a death doula training course. So a death doula is a non-medical support person who provides guidance and care to dying people and their loved ones. So if we're going to consider data as digital remains, it makes sense that the support structures that exist in a non-medical capacity for physical death would also be useful in a digital context. And the death doula community was also a really fruitful avenue for networking and recruiting research participants. So over the last 5 years, my 4 studies gathered the experiences of 76 adults in the US and the UK, English-speaking people. And with these people, I recorded over 150 hours of interviews, mostly on video chat, except for one that was in person. And then I conducted, I don't know how many hours of grounded analysis and theory building through qualitative coding. And here's what I learned. So in this section, I'm going to discuss the findings of each study in turn. And after the first 3 evaluation studies, I have a bit of meta-analysis about them. And then I'll tell you how those studies led to the research question for my 4th and final study. So the first study, how do people think and communicate about their own social media legacies? So break this question into 2. How do people think about their own social media legacies? The simple answer is they did not. They did not think much about it, at least not in the process of choosing the legacy content. They found the feature, they chose their person, and they sent that pre-written message. Very quick process. But the second part, how do they communicate about it with that person? The answer is similar. They didn't communicate very much. They read the message and then they acknowledged it, often with an emoji or a sticker, and that was it. That was the extent of the interaction that the legacy contact and the account holder had. So this touches on what prior research calls the desirable to inherit problem, which basically says that people tend to not think about their technology or their data as something that their loved ones would want to keep from them after they die. So here's how one participant described what they did. Amy said, I picked my sister because she's my little sister. Obviously, I care about her and I trust her. We didn't talk until after I already chose her because I know her and we know each other. I sent the message and she was like, yeah, I got that the other day. That's cool. And I was like, all right, so we're pretty chill about that. So in Amy's description, we don't see a lot of technical detail or any motive behind her decision-making, but we do get a lot of context about the nature of her relationship with her sister and how well they know each other. So Amy's comments display a lot of the commonalities among the experiences of my 30 participants in this study. Their choices were based on relationships. Who knows me best? Who will act like I would or knows for sure what I would have done in a situation where I am not present? And this is not necessarily a legal next of kin. So legacy contact is allowed to exist outside of legal defaults that might exist for other structures of postmortem tasks. And in general, my participants didn't discuss specifics at all. We expected that people would. The process itself in the message prompts them to talk in person, but only 2 out of my 30 participants had any in-depth discussions. So the reason for this relational focus and this lack of specifics is that my participants were sure that as long as the right person was present to make decisions, what they decided to do didn't matter as much as who they are. But there were consequences to not discussing specifics or having detailed instructions, and those become clear in the second study. Here I spoke with active legacy contacts, people who had lost a loved one and were actively managing their Facebook profile to find out what their experiences were. I started each interview by asking, Hey, whose profile are you managing? Tell me a little bit about them. And then from there, I focused the conversation on how they became the legacy contact and what they had done since then. I'll use participant number 20's words to give you an idea. He said, I figured out his email password, so I was able to reset my dad's Facebook password, and that's how I got into his account. Then from there, I was able to name myself a legacy contact. So this configuration of the settings after the death had already occurred was not unique to participant number 20. He was one of 20 out of my 28 participants in this study who had been self-selected as legacy contacts. But they had done so with the acknowledgement and approval of the other people who had also loved this person. Often they were the tech person in the family. Mom would hand you the computer and say, you can take care of the online stuff, right? So those are the people that I spoke with. So think about what this process was actually like for participant 20 and the 19 others who made themselves legacy contacts. So the process as designed, one form, one email, change is done. Meant to be very simple, but this is what my participants actually experienced. After the death had occurred, they went searching for information. They had no idea what to do, and they got information any way they could, from Google searches to calling people. And then they managed to gain access to the deceased person's Facebook account, set themselves as the legacy contact, and then sign out and sign back in as themselves to request memorialization. And then they felt really limited in what they were able to do. So remember, legacy contacts can only do a few things. They went through all these steps, they checked the boxes, they did their homework, only to be given just a few options. So this is how participant number 5 described that experience. She said, it's like you're going on vacation and you need your friend to come in and take the mail and everything like that. You give them the keys because it's the mutual understanding that they can trust you with their keys to do whatever they need to do in your home. You can't do that with a legacy account. The person gives you a key, but it's like it opens up a certain room instead of the entire house. So I want you to see this phrase that she used, whatever they need to do. This is how trust works in relationships. It's rooted in addressing uncertainty. It's rooted in addressing any unpredictable thing that comes up. It's very open-ended. But that very open-ended sort of do whatever expectation is based on these people knowing each other, that the trusted person would act in the right way that the account holder would have wanted or would have done themselves. And it's really hard to do this kind of trust in computational systems while still making it clear that it's a proxy person acting and not the deceased themselves. So to achieve that clarity with legacy contact, computational trust in this system says you are authorized to do 4 things. And for my participants, these limitations didn't reflect the relationship that they had with this person that they've lost. Of course, there's the option to not have a memorial account at all. Delete after death is the other option. I examined both sides of this experience as well. What is deletion like? Why is deletion desirable for account holders? And what's deleting a dead person's profile actually like? I want to note that this research question had some input from Facebook's memorialization team because they had noticed that people were having a lot of trouble and difficulty with the deletion of deceased people's accounts. So once again, I'll start with the first part of the question. What makes people want to delete their accounts after they're dead? So participant 7 explained it this way. They said, I would choose to delete account after death because then I wouldn't annoy anyone. So I want to point out 3 things about this simple statement. First, participant 7 said they would choose delete account after death. They didn't realize they already had, because we recruited participants directly from Facebook's internal information about who had configured their settings that way. But somehow participant 7 was not aware that they had done so. Next, they said I when talking about their profile. So this kind of personifying language around profiles was really common across all 4 of my studies. And it indicates that on some level, people know that they are present through their profiles. So finally, what P What P7 wanted to accomplish with deletion was to not annoy anyone. They recognize and are familiar with this algorithmic cruelty that can happen, and they want to spare that kind of pain from happening to their loved ones. So participant 7 illustrated a few of the general sentiments of my participants who had selected delete after death. They wanted the simplest, least burdensome option for their loved ones. But when I asked them, well, what if your family doesn't ever delete it? What if they decide to keep it or do something else? My participants didn't feel strongly about their wishes or requests being followed. They said things like, I won't be around to argue with them, will I? And they said, my family should be able to do whatever they need to do in that moment. But unfortunately, configuring delete after death doesn't leave that option to survivors. And I learned this when I spoke with 5 people who had experienced the deletion of their deceased loved one's account. All 5 of them did not expect it. They did not know that that was what was going to happen. So remember, this process is meant to be like simple and easy, just as it is with memorialization. You fill out the form, you receive a confirmation email, and then the changes have been made. But deletion was very sudden for these people, and it was all encompassing. They weren't aware of what all was going to be deleted. So here's what that quick and simple process was like for participant number 5. She said, I called my sister and I told her, Dad's gone, like gone. Facebook gone. It was devastating. So what participant 5 is describing here is another supporting point to data being digital remains. Patrick Stokes actually calls this kind of experience a second death. She didn't say Dad's Facebook page is gone. She said Dad's gone. And this was 3 or 4 days after he had passed away from COVID-19, actually. So because this family had an expectation that they would be able to do all sorts of things involved in making the memorial for their father, at the very least gather photos from his profile, they were really upset about not being able to do that. So the contrast between deletion as a choice and deletion as an experience is pretty clear here. I call it the deletion dilemma because deletion is a popular preference for account holders, but it's because they see it as a simple and not burdensome choice for their loved ones, and they have complete control over that choice as the account holder, and the platform is bound to follow their wishes. But they're not impacted by the deletion of their profile the way that their survivors are. And then when deletion does happen, it's painful. They have little, excuse me, survivors have little to no control over when and how deletion happens. And they just have that one form. There's no appeal process. And they're highly impacted by this. So this dilemma is about how we might honor the stated wishes of the account holders who have died and the emerging needs of surviving loved ones, when the motive behind the account holder's decision can only be accomplished by making a different choice than what they stated. So the misalignments in these studies, they end up falling into a classic category of difficulty in computer-supported cooperative work. It's about balancing the need for an easy to complete setup process that accomplishes a task with the need for careful consideration and detailed instructions to be communicated and understood between different parties. But the balance is particularly consequential here because there's no opportunity for correction. Most of the time, this configuration is happening after the death has already occurred. So everything kind of falls on these surviving loved ones. So in light of that work, the way that work was happening, I turned my research attention to the complexities of post-mortem work. I wanted to know how the experience of post-mortem data management, either memorializing or deleting, could be made meaningful. So I turned to the things that already exist in our culture and exist in our everyday lives that slow us down and help us form expectations and define meanings in a given experience. So I started looking at rituals. This is the research question of my 4th and final study. Could ritual-based guidance for post-mortem data management or disposal create a meaningful and intentional experience for surviving loved ones? So here's a quick 101 of what makes a ritual. And this is the most general definition possible. There's a fixed time, fixed location, fixed invitees. There's a defined beginning, an opening that identifies now we are separating from normal time and we're going into special time. There's prearranged actions and words that are often familiar to the people that are participating. So it sets expectations and it empowers people to participate. And those words and actions articulate meaning. They don't just say what is happening, but they say why. And then there's a distinct closing that marks that we have achieved what we set out to complete and now we are done and you can go back to normal time. So using this model, I recruited participants to make decisions and carry out memorialization or deletion of a deceased loved one's profile. I ended up working with 6 women who were part of my community to varying degrees, who had all lost a loved one in the last year. So 3 of these participants had lost their spouses and 3 of them had lost a parent. And all of these participants reported not having any real previous knowledge of Facebook's options. So I walked them through the options. We went step by step through the details of what would happen. I used specific examples from the deceased person's content about what would happen to that content to help them make the right decision for themselves and their loved ones about what should happen to the profile. And then we walked through the process of memorializing or deleting the profile. So I guided them through the process. We verified that the change had occurred, and then I asked them some reflection questions about that experience. So what my participants ended up deciding is that 3 of them chose to memorialize their person's account. 2 of them deferred the choice. They said, I feel like I have enough information to make a decision at a later date, but I'm not ready to do anything yet. And 1 participant chose to have her parents' profile deleted. All of them contacted loved ones and consulted with them before taking any actions. And they told me afterwards that those conversations had been really good, that they'd said, hey, thanks for letting me know ahead of time what's going to happen. And also indicative of the findings from the previous studies, whatever you decide to do is probably the right thing. But overall, each participant accomplished the management tasks that they needed to, and none of them had distinctly painful or difficult experiences with this. We didn't end up doing the kind of elaborate rituals that I had imagined, but the time and support that I spent with each participant was enough to make a meaningful experience for them. So why do these findings matter? What are the implications for how postmortem data management should look going forward? So I'll start with the purely practical. For social media platforms, I have great news about the implications, and it's that the technology exists. This system that Facebook created for postmortem data management, it's working pretty well. The people that were using it as designed, they appreciated having the memorialized profiles. And they even found comfort in being able to have some control, even if they never used the capabilities that were available to them. So platforms just have to create a path for stewardship. But on top of that, they should enable community guidance around it. Once one person has accomplished or figured out how to do this postmortem data management thing, they tend to be really eager to help other people do the same thing. So platforms could create visibility around, or let people opt into visibility rather, about who has done postmortem data management and who's willing to help other people understand how it works. So this isn't a scenario where we need to invent a new technology or come up with a device or a process that doesn't yet exist in order to accomplish this thing. It's entirely possible right now. But the next implication is a little bit more difficult. When you think of computational advances and new technologies, they're usually about eliminating work and about taking things off of our plates, streamlining, simplifying, making work be less burdensome for people. But this is a space where doing the work ourselves actually really matters. The process matters and we can't skip it or gloss over it. And that work should be focused on how survivors' data is connected to that of the deceased. the work of stewardship is really important for people who are bereaved. So it's important because making and recognizing and making memorials is part of how people enter into this essential human experience of the grief process. So to enable this work and to enable it to be slow and meaningful, I propose a lens through which to view platform users that may help design teams on any social media platform to make good options available for when, not if, their account holders die. I propose that they see identity as an affective constellation. So this concept is instructive for how to view people. So walk through it with me. Think of a celestial constellation. We're all familiar with the Big Dipper, I think. It's familiar to us. You might see a trapezoid, but you might also see the Great Bear or drinking gourd. So understanding a constellation is culturally bound. So it's very subjective. It's also relationally based. You recognize this based on its location to other things in the sky. And it's also dynamic. It's subtly moving, and it's part of a system that is always subtly moving. So an affective constellation is similar, and it's an identifiable shape of a human, of a person, by their surfaces of contact. And surfaces of contact are just how we interact with ideas, values, especially other people, but also objects like an image or a book. But unlike celestial constellations, humans aren't just a collection of points. Our surfaces are continually shaping and being shaped by what we come in contact with. So as a community, you're kind of a collection of constellations in contact. So in this, through this lens, emotions are moments of understanding how something is shaping us. And they're moments of us characterizing our contact with any given thing. So when a person dies, their affective constellation becomes static. It stops being shaped. It stops initiating the shaping of other things. So the affect of grief, all the emotions that we feel in the context of being bereaved, are contact with stillness, contact with absence. Normally I contact you and we move and push against each other, but a deceased person will no longer move and be shaped. But for survivors, they will never be shaped as if that person had never been there. The presence of the deceased still remains in a really important way. It's just very different. So this is precisely why deletion was so painful for my participants. The online representations of their person may have stopped responding in algorithmic ways as they should, but it also erased histories of contact, which are part of the shapes of living people. But these pains could be avoided if designers consider people as affective constellations in this way. So here's a few questions they could ask to do so. First, what are the ideas, values, relationships, and objects that make this person who they are? Answers to this question are likely to surface appropriate stewards that should be allowed to make decisions about postmortem data. Next, what records of their contact exist in our platform? These are going to be the things that make up the online representation of this person's constellation in the specific context of the data they created in that particular digital space. And also, what surfaces of other account holders are, what surfaces of other account holders would retain the identifiable shape of the deceased person? Where were they in contact with the deceased, and how should we consider what that contact is going to be like in the context of the data? So along with data that has become sentimental because this person has passed away, this question could call attention to things like group photos and community discussions that might have been deleted, or the authenticity of which could have been damaged by deleting that person's contributions to it. So in a person's affective constellation, postmortem data was one method of contact that they had for their relationships during their lifetime. And it's also records of all that contact. So by maintaining records of all the contact, postmortem data has created an echo of a person's presence in the digital world. So to conclude, I want to answer what my title promised that I would. I want you to understand that people feel connected to postmortem data, not just because it has become sentimental, but because it represents part of who living people are too. So how should we delete such a thing? How should we delete the dead? Well, here's what our supermarket did with their memorial fence. The company provided flowers that filled the fence from end to end. And they invited the community to come over several days and dissolve the memorial fence by taking flowers away with them. So this was a communal work that led people to understand and be comfortable with what this space needs to be next. So if people want their online data to be deleted after they die, my dream for the experiences that their survivors would have is something like this. We should take our time. We should involve people who want to be involved. We should let them understand what's going to happen. And we should let them take pieces of it with them if they want to. So we should delete the dead thoughtfully and in community together. Thank you all. I want to thank my wonderful committee members, my advisor and chair, Dr. Judd Brubaker, who has, I have no words for all of that yet. Dr. Wendy Monker, who's joining us from Scotland, Dr. Nabila Chaibi from the Media Studies Department, Laura Devendorf from Atlas, and Dr. Casey Fiesler, also from Information Science, as well as countless colleagues, friends, and family, so many of you who have supported me through this. I am so thrilled to have your support and to have you with me today. So now we can move to questions and discussion.
All right, I think that that slide might be one of the more honest slides about the number of people we always have to thank.
Yes. Yes.
Let's go ahead and turn over to Q&A from the committee. As a reminder, we're going to start with Dr. Munker. We'll do one question, but there'll be 2 rounds. And of course, as I promised, Wendy, you have the option to delay if you want someone else to go first.
Thank you so much, Katie.
Could I ask? I'm going to let you go ahead and have the audio there.
Okay.
Sorry, Wendy.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you so much, Katie, for your talk. Could I ask you to stop sharing your slides?
Sure. Yes, I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording at this point as well.
Thank you so much. Great.
We would like to, maybe everyone on Zoom hi Zoom people, can join us in congratulating Dr. Gach and successfully. He does have feedback and some revisions, but we're really thrilled with what you put together and the tremendous contribution it makes to our field, of course, to your future. I'll be giving you individual notes, but for the moment, we can just celebrate. So,
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
I'll give you my favorite celebration emoji, which is I call the exploding croissant.